It's time to welcome our keynote speaker. We are grateful and humbled to have Mase III as our keynote speaker today. Mase is a Black, trans, queer poet and educator based in Seattle by way of Philly. As an educator, Mase has worked with community members in the US, UK, and Canada on the needs of LGBTQIA+ folks and racial justice in spaces such as K-12 schools, universities, faith communities, and restricted care facilities. He is founder of Awkward, the first trans and queer people of color talent agency. Mase is the author of And Then I Got Fired, One Trans Queer's Reflection on Grief, Unemployment, and Inappropriate Jokes About Death, as well as White Folks Be Trippin', and ethnography through poetry and prose. His work has been featured on MSNBC, Essence Live, Everyday Feminism, Black Girl Dangerous, The New York Times, BuzzFeed, Blavidity, The Root, The Huffington Post, TEDx, and more. Currently, he is head writer for the theatrical production Black Boys and is co-director of the forthcoming documentary, The Black Trans Prayer Book. After his keynote, we are going to open the floor up to any questions you might have. You can just type them into the chat box. Without further ado, everyone, please welcome Mase III.
Thank you. Thank you. So good to see everyone. Good to be able to watch folks in the chat and kind of pay attention to everyone engaging for today. As was said, my name is Mase III, Mase or Mase for short. I use he, him as pronouns. And we're going to get into some fun things today, hopefully, right? So I would love to start off our session for today, one, by saying that my keynote for today is dedicated to Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks, to trans folks, to queer folks, to disabled folks, to anyone who's ever had their power attempted to be taken from them. My keynote is dedicated to all of us, right? And so, yeah, and so I want to start us off with a poem. And if you're ready to get into a poem with me, let me know in the chat that you're ready to get in a poem with me. So let me know in the chat, because I'm going to give you a task, because we're going to do this poem together. So let me know in the chat that you are ready for a poem. Let me know in the chat that you're ready for a poem. Okay? All right. Okay. And so I also want to give a bit of a trigger warning to some of my poetic work for today. So because we live in a world that is often anti-Black, that is often trans-antagonistic, so some of the things that I cover might deal with genocidal violence, might deal with, of course, anti-Black violence, things like that. So just a trigger warning on my poems for some of that stuff, right? With that, I want to get into talking about this next piece. So what you're going to do is I'm going to ask you to say something. And when it's time for you to say something, it's going to be very obvious to you. I just want you to type it into the chat, because like I said, we're going to do this poem together. We're going to do this poem together, right? And this is my favorite poem right now. You know, of all my work, this is my favorite. And it's called Zone of Rarity, okay? So let me know and we'll get started. So when I say story time, y'all say story time, story time.
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 When I say true story, y'all say true story. True story.
True story.
So the other day, I dreamt I was cuddling with a human-sized platypus. I stroked its beak and its tail. I wrapped my arms around it, and it made a sound I did not recognize. But that sound felt a lot like joy and calm and loyalty. I hear that's what some people call love. And maybe I didn't know what love sounded like until that moment, but that's not surprising to me, because survivors were like that. We're used to mistaking chaos for love. We've been trained to call our very realities things that they are not. So this clarity in my spirit was new. I woke up all rejuvenated and wanted to know everything about the love of my dreams. So I read every encyclopedia entry, every Wikipedia article, listened to every TED talk I could find about the platypus, but they all described it the same way, said that it was weird and strange, that it had the bill of a duck and the tail of a beaver. But how strange does that sound to the platypus, that you could be saying it has the tail of a creature it's never even shared the same continent with. It's like if it has the bill of a platypus and the tail of a platypus and poison spurs in its feet like a platypus, it's probably not a duck. It's like calling it a thing it is not. It's like when colonizers that called themselves scientists landed on what was once a Black continent we now call Australia. You know, when they first saw the platypus, they thought it was a joke. They thought someone was playing a trick. They thought someone actually wasted their day gluing bills onto the faces of rats, so they tried to remove the bill from the face of the platypus and subsequently killed a lot of platypuses that way, trying to uncover the joke. Turns out the joke was murder because they were insistent on calling a thing it was not. It's like, maybe my gender is a platypus. You know, folks always insistent on labeling parts of my body things that they are not. It's sort of like when Columbus landed on Hispaniola and Balboa landed in North America and Hawkins landed in West Africa, and they saw all these Black and brown bodies. They saw men and women, and they saw something else they thought was a joke. Someone playing a trick. They saw all these people that lay between their understandings of gender and sometimes somehow even beyond them. You know, some at the time called us healers. Some called us just purely divine. Now some of us just call it trans for short, but to them, it was a joke. It was someone playing a trick. So maybe that's why. Maybe that's why they ordered us killed by dogs. Maybe that's why they burned us alive. Maybe that's why they tried to kill everyone that ever saw us as holy. Maybe that's the punchline, because the joke to white supremacy is always murder. It's like when they told us they were bringing us civility on Black and brown soil, but what they meant was that they were bringing us the transatlantic slave trade, because they like to call a thing it is not. It's like, maybe my name is a platypus. You know, because when I say it, people tell me that's not what it should be, when really my ancestors called for me and I responded back, and they told me there is nothing Blacker than me calling my own name into existence. But to you, maybe it's a joke, and maybe that joke is suppression, because supremacy always tries to kill things it doesn't understand. You know, I hear abusers do that sometimes. Try to devalue things they don't understand and call things that they are not. So I may call that gaslighting. They may call it law and order. They may call it civility. They may call it a joke or a trick on them, a trick on their science, a trick on their biology, a trick on their power, a trick on their legal system, a trick on their supremacy, a trick on their superiority, a trick on their religiosity. But there will always be the platypus, even when you laugh behind its back, even when you deny its power and its poison in every step it takes. Underwater, it senses electrical pulses to find its food and the things that it will prey on. It reminds me of myself and the ways that I sense BS and decide what kinds of energy I will or will not feed on. Even when you think I'm a joke, that my body is weird and strange, even when you call me a thing I am not. Maybe I'm not a platypus. Maybe I am just defiance with venom in my walk. Maybe it is just my familiar. Maybe I'm just familiar with the ways white supremacy works. Maybe my familiar teaches me to always call a thing exactly what it is, and I call you. Okay. So thank y'all for co-doing that with me. Thank y'all so much. Yeah, and so I think that piece for me kind of speaks to the connection. So I know that earlier during the This Is Not a Land Acknowledgement poem, right, that there was talk about the relationship between land and liberation, land and justice, right? And so I see a lot of connections between the ways that we divorce ourselves from the natural world and the plight of who we are as Black, brown, and indigenous folks, as trans folks in particular, and the medicalization of our bodies, the ways that we're often robbed of rights for not fitting into narratives that align with cisgender, heterosexual, patriarchal ways of being, right? So all that. Yeah, and so next I kind of want to do a little task with you before I go into my other poems. Is that okay? Y'all ready for a task? I love giving tasks. It makes me feel good, like we're doing something together. Let me know if you're ready for a task, okay? Yes. Oh, great. We're all ready for a task, okay? And so what I did today, as far as for my presentation, I named it Justice, Intentionality, and Surviving a Pandemic, because my first thought was like, I'm gonna put all this tons of information, we're gonna go back and forth about all these definitions, all this stuff. And I was like, y'all, this is the end of the day of a conference, right? Already during a pandemic, y'all already being rock stars, doing all the things that y'all do. Shout out to all the organizers and everybody that put this on. And I thought what's most important is us getting to stuff to help us better connect with each other, better connect with our issues, and better be prepared for how we feel with each other going forward into justice work, right? So I wanted to really pare down my chat for today. I want to also, I said earlier who I wanted to dedicate this talk to. I also want to dedicate it to Victoria. Victoria being, is everyone ready for some history actually? I know I gave a little bit of history in my poem just now. Like I said, that's all true story, all those different pieces. But so Victoria was an ancestor that I want to call into the space. And so Victoria was from the land that is currently known as Benin, and she was an African woman, an African trans woman who was enslaved by Belgians in the 1500s. And so when she was enslaved in the 1500s by Belgians, she was consistently given men's clothing to wear, and she actually refused it. She said no, and she would make her own clothing, and she would make her own garments and very detailed garments to wear. And everything that her community members referred to her as, so other people who also came from her land in her community as other enslaved Africans, kept translating back into words like healer, herbalist, medicine person, right? That she, as a trans person, had a very specific role. And it is not possible to understand racial justice without understanding trans liberation, as well as it is not possible to understand trans liberation without understanding racial justice, because the first people to experience trans antagonism on this continent were indigenous folks and enslaved Africans, right? So I just want us to be upfront with that. So I want to shout out to Victoria and call her into the space, right? For people that are not familiar with me, just a very quick piece, right? So as was shared in my bio, I'm a poet, I'm an educator, I'm an author. And I'm just really excited to be here with y'all. I'm really excited to connect. I told y'all I was giving y'all a task, so I want to kind of move forward with that. And so the task that I'm going to give y'all today, okay? So the task I'm going to give y'all today is I'm going to give you about 5 minutes on the clock. When I give you 5 minutes, I want you to write down for yourself, and I'm going to later ask you to put this in the chat. But what I want you to do in 5 minutes is describe what you envision a more equitable world to be, right? So when you envision a more equitable world, what does that actually seem like, feel like, smell like, all that, right? Who lives there in this more equitable world that you envision? What are the rules? How do you all deal with conflict, right? Because in a more equitable world, does that mean there's no conflict? No, that's not possible. We're human beings, right? Like we have conflict, right? How do we actually deal with conflict in your more equitable world, right? Does everyone understand what I'm asking for? Everyone understand what I'm asking for? If you do not understand what I'm asking for, you can put something in the chat, or you can come off mute. But if you understand what I'm asking for, right? Okay. So I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock, and I'm going to leave you all to your writing devices, and I'll see you back in 5 minutes. Okay. about 2 more minutes. Okay. So that is time. That is time. Okay. Yeah, and so what I would love for y'all to do right now, is if you could pop into the chat, what are some of the things that came up for you thinking about your more equitable world? So what came up for you in thinking about your more equitable world? And if anybody wants to dare to come off mute, you can also feel free to share it on the live too. Okay, so I see a more equitable world. Let me see if I can scroll. If I can scroll fast enough to keep up with y'all. Y'all quick, okay? All right. A more equitable world is giving space back to those who had systemically and historically been silenced. A more equitable world is community focused, holding those in power accountable. Yes, accountability. More equity today would involve people like me giving back to groups and communities, like donating money to local Native American tribes and finding something every day to inspire me to continue to engage. Equality is stalled by absence of empathy. Yes to that. And I think that piece around empathy, that is a big thing that is often missing from our conversations. People assume there's this place in which we're in the same room and so we're having a conversation, so that work is being done. That doesn't mean anything. Like, we actually have to believe in another person's story or that their life is valuable. If I don't have empathy for your life, I'm certainly not doing anything to move forward with your justice, right? Even if I learn some fancy new words, even if I, read a book or two over here, right? What am I actually doing if I'm not invested in your actual life, right? There was actually, and so one thing I'll actually share, so even just more that stick out to me, there was this study done a while ago, a long time ago. I'm saying a long time ago. This is like 6 years ago, okay? Not a long time ago, but 6 years ago, right? And I think it came out of the University of Pennsylvania. And it was this doctor, and he was specifically looking at, he's specifically looking at brainstem injuries, right? And so he said, that typically when you talk about brainstem injuries, that there is this idea that they won't heal. And he said that's not true. He's like, sometimes, depending on the injury, sometimes the cells just regenerate so slowly, it might not matter in your lifetime. I think that a lot too around sometimes of empathy, that some people like, especially white communities, many like cisgender, heterosexual communities are taught, many able-bodied communities are taught such a lack of empathy that and are so committed to that lack of empathy that the little bit of language that they might learn might not matter in our lifetime about what they're actually going to do. And so how do we actually move forward with people that are ready to move so that other people come forward by proxy and not necessarily relying on people that might not move that far during the course of their entire lifetime, right? Does that make sense for people? Let me know if that makes sense. An equitable world to me has no money. Yes, okay. Capitalism does not exist in an equitable world, right? Every person has not just a house, but a home, right? Person does not need to work, right? All those things, okay? Just skimming some of these. Yeah, much greater equity of work, of wealth, I mean. Equity. Can I share mine off mute? So Gabriel, yes, you can if you'd like to.
Yeah, I was just kind of surprised at how I wrote this. I found it kind of nice. So I wrote, I believe in a more equitable world where I can be surrounded by people of different gender, ethnicity, and culture, with diverse smells in taste and cuisine, diverse sights in fashion, and diverse sounds in language. I imagine a world not bound by the looks of others, but by the actions of others. And I imagine a world of peace, love, and community.
Good stuff. Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Good stuff. So I'm looking over some of these other, yeah, and so just thinking about, and so just even reflecting on what you just shared. So I think sometimes people are, because I think that that idea, I think that comes up in so many different people's places. Like, what is an equitable world? How's it, who is there? We imagine this world that's multicultural, that's multinational, without borders, place where everyone can commingle. And how would our lives actually have to fundamentally change to make that happen? Because I hear so many of us say things like that, or want for things like that, or pine for things like that. What would we actually have to give up? So this is the question I'm going to actually ask y'all to answer the chat. What would actually have to be given up for a world like that to actually exist, right? For us to have equity of resources, to have equity of thoughts around especially targeted groups right now, being able to share space around thoughts, rights, all that kind of stuff. What would actually have to, because I think we talk about so much about what it offers people. Like sometimes we talk about justice from a place of what does it offer white people to have a racially just world, right? Like, why is that the focus, right? Well, there's something that has to also be named about what would actually white folks have to give up for a racially equitable world to exist? What would cisgender and especially heterosexual straight people have to give up for a world in which trans and queer people were able to also be treated equitably? What would they have to give up for that to exist, right? What would able-bodied people have to give up in order for disabled folks to live in a world that was equitable, right? So, right, let me know in the chat. Yeah, and so, so thank you all for all your answers. I'm going to share, as y'all are kind of popping in that reflection, those other reflections in there. I'm going to share this next little reflection before I go into my other poems for tonight / this afternoon. One thing I often notice when I ask people about this activity, and particularly during this activity, is three major frameworks that happen when we talk about and envisioning this more equitable world, which is also why I wanted to talk about what we would have to give up, right? The three major frameworks as I see them, and I know this came up a little bit earlier today, is one, there are people in creating a more equitable world that say, I haven't witnessed any problems, so everything is fine. So maybe my equitable world is, maybe changing something minimally, right? So, or changing nothing at all, right? That this world itself is fine. There's often reformationists, right? And I think the two most competing places, especially when we're in conversations about justice, tends to be reformationists and abolitionists. So reformationists being folks that might say there are issues that can be solved by fixing the system, right? And so might work to toil to fix the system. Versus people who are abolitionists, where that might look more like these issues exist because of the system and can only be fixed by deconstructing it entirely. I see so many folks get stalled because what they don't realize that they're actually arguing against is not merely just how to do a thing, but like what the actual end goal is, right? That I see so many people arguing across these lines of reformationists and abolitionists, not knowing that that's what they're doing. And so being honest with yourselves that when you're thinking about your more equitable world, what kind of work are you seeking towards to do? I'll say, selfishly, I'm more in the framework of abolitionist work. And so I tend to do work that is leading towards that goal versus folks who believe often the system can be tweaked or solved, right? I think even across different communities, we often disagree about which is the more equitable routes in the world at the end of large. But I really want to ask y'all to sit and think about for yourselves, are you which sort of camp are you in, because that will also dictate as we get into questions later about what does your version of activism look like? What does your version of ending point actually look like? What are you actually working to get to? So I think we can't really put together a plan if we don't know what we're working towards. So I'm going to just end that there. Yeah. And so what I'm going to do is I wanted to leave some time for questions and things like that, but I want to share, is it okay if I share like 3 more poems and stuff like that before we get into questions? Does that feel good for folks? Yep. Yes, no, yes, no.
Please.
Okay, so I never ask a rhetorical question. I don't believe in it, okay? I come from a community of call and response. So we in this again together, okay? And so this poem I'm gonna do, this is a new poem for me. And so this is a poem that I wrote for, yeah, I guess during the pandemic. If you're a writer, I don't know how people have been feeling during the pandemic. I haven't really been writing as much as I would typically do because of the pandemic, which I think, again, when we talk about this theme of intentionality, the reality is right now, so many of us are burned out, not because we want to be, not because there's not work to do, but because we are surviving some things in all kinds of different directions, right? And so this is a piece called My Favorite Flower Blooms in Winter. Times like these offer you lessons you never would have asked for. Like sometimes you don't know if you are standing at a garden or a gravesite, but guess what? The flowers bloom regardless. And every poem you write doesn't have to be a masterpiece. It can just be its own grief container. Chrysanthemums don't care about your confusion or your self-pity. The soil will get aerated either way. That is, if you aren't too self-consumed thinking about some stuff you did 10 years ago that no one else remembers during lockdown. Raise your hand if you think that's you. If that's you, I dare you to forgive your anxiety. It isn't sure if you're being chased or prepared. It wears purple. It was passed down to you by magic or blood. I promise it doesn't matter which. It's older than linear time. I don't remember what age I was exactly when I learned that George Washington's dentures weren't wood at all, but tortured teeth of enslaved Africans that sang sweetly, made me think of how jealous he must have been of a Black man's smile, that he wanted to bust out his own gospel hymns, and how colonizing lingered on his breath and knocked him off key. And I want to hug a little boy named Devontae Hart, but only if he needs it. I want to remind him, no matter what a white woman tells you, fearing cops is normal, and that hugs are supposed to be soft, an invitation, a comfort, a healing, not a lesson in coercion that I wish you never had to learn. Whiteness will use its proximity to you to prove its own political point, which is sometimes they just put us in pictures sometimes to feel something. A boy told me Jim Jones started from a good place and got distracted because it's important for white folks to believe they start from a good place, even when the evidence of evil might hang bitter in their juice. My altar keeps getting too big for my mantle, and there are too many baby pictures on there. Maybe it's a nursery in reverse. Whenever I leave the funeral of a trans person, I call my mother almost immediately, and we go over a kind of script of what she is and is not allowed to do. Should I be buried first? She swears she understands, but I keep going to funerals where there are always people who know better than the person misgendered in their grave for eternity, and I think it must give them bed sores to have to keep turning like that. And I want Brayla Stone's spirit to rest. I want Maya Hall's spirit to rest. I want Blake Brockington's spirit to rest. I want my siblings to rest, and I want to be in a garden where children wear petal crowns with roses and lilies and daffodils. I sometimes feel I am on the land of my ancestors, where my people were able to fall in love and conjure up generations of warriors bathed and basked in the sun with lightning strikes by their side. And sometimes I'm clear we're captive to enemy borders whose only job is plunging nuclear waste deep into the ground to poison us for centuries as punishment for surviving. Truth is, you might be being chased, you might be being prepared, but either way, these flowers were destined to bloom. So let's just say this is, in fact, a garden. There are no prizes for telling the future, and these stanzas are just a string of endless thoughts bouncing off the walls of your apartment, because this pandemic keeps raging on. So grab your tools and shaky hands. We got seeds to plant and plots that need tending to. Right. Thank y'all. Okay. Yeah, so I'm gonna do another piece that is, so this particular piece, yeah, I'm gonna do this piece. Yeah, I'm gonna do this piece. And so this particular piece, it's a, I grew up in a Christian and Muslim household. So a lot of my work also talks a lot about religious violence. So if anyone wants to ever talk about nerdy theology stuff, that's also my bag. Yeah, so I'm like going back and forth about which piece I want to do. Yeah, no. So this is a piece actually about my favorite story within Quran, my favorite story within Bible. Yeah, and just about transness, okay? Let me know if you're ready for this poem in the chat. Let me know if you're ready for this poem in the chat. Okay. Said super ready. Okay. Okay, super ready. Okay, I see that. All right. And so this is a poem called Josephine. She asks if she can talk to me about Jesus at 3 a.m. on the C train because something about my trans face means clearly I'm on a path straight to hell. I've come to expect this type of reaction from strangers at least once a week since the first time I was exercised at 16. But today I've grown tired and I've decided it is my turn to proselytize. So before you do any of that, I want to know from you, have you heard the good word about Joseph of Genesis? See, Joseph of Josephine, Joe of Genesis, favorite child of Jacob, aka Israel. When asked what you wanted, you desired one thing, a ketoneth pasim. Pastor called this a royal coat, and Joe, I had never read the Bible before, found you and kept reading Josephine. I got to 2 Samuel and realized your coat of many colors was a princess dress. Joseph, your father must have really loved you because he got it for you and you wore it with pride. Joe, when your brothers saw you in your flowing dress, in your glory, they became enraged. I am sorry for the beating you received. Sorry they destroyed your dress and smeared it with the red paint of your swollen veins. Josephine, did you know they told your father you were dead? So he never come looking for you. Never knew your brothers sold you as a slave into Egypt. And once you were stolen from your home fields, the earth dried up. Joe, the very ground on which you walked, mourned the loss of its genderqueer child, and all the plants died. And the animals no longer have the will to live. Josephine, your family nearly starved, saw the formation of ribs where once there grew flesh and belly fat, and they, hungry and desperate, traveled into Egypt. And what must they have seen, Joe? See, in Egypt, people discovered you. Not as just gay, not as just trans, they saw you in totality. You went from slave to leader over lands. There you were, Josephine, as you, as magnificent. And your family couldn't even recognize you through the glare of divinity, but you saw them shivering in fear, waiting to hear what this regal leader might say, wondering if your spirit might see fit to grant them the grain needed to survive. And Joseph's love broke through the darkness of resentment. And for the first time, your family saw you, as magnificent. For it was your word that saved them from starvation, dear Joseph of Genesis, aka Josephine, aka Joe. I'm claiming your story for every trans kid told that we're unholy. I'm claiming your story for every queer told that in order to love, we must let our faith die. I'm going to put it in a pocket over my heart, next to Ruth and Naomi, next to David and Jonathan, next to Higai and Deborah, and seat them at the last Passover with Jesus and Lazarus. Yes, I'm taking Jesus with me too, dear pastor. To you, who claims your words are from God, but whose book has been pledged to King James, know what allegiances you keep. We have been lying about my people for too long. Okay. And so again, for my nerdy theologians in the group, or people that are just surviving religious violence, especially as trans and queer folks, that's the story of Yusuf in the Quran, story of Joseph in Genesis. And if you don't read none of those things, because you're like, I am beyond religion, I don't even be thinking about that. It's the story of Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat as told by Broadway. So if you have no investment in Quran and Bible, I'm hoping you at least know about and love Broadway, okay? So thank y'all for letting me share that piece. Yeah, I'm just gonna do one more quick poem. I'm like, ooh, which piece is the last piece? I was gonna, in my spirit, I had more time. But yeah, we'll see after questions. So this next piece is really short, and it's why I like it is it's actually for an elder of mine. So I think for you all, especially as folks in college or at least college age, for y'all in high school, um, you know, there's this place in which that there's places when I think you realize that you might have some more maturity than some of the adults in your life around certain topics, certain things, or you might have just some more knowledge or more spaces where you're able to be even more free than sometimes the adults in your life are. The first time I really recognized that as a trans person and as a queer person, I was in college, and it was in particular when I was listening to a poet that I had been obsessed with um, for most of my life, right? And so to me, she was this out queer woman in the world who I knew to be living with her partner, and I realized that in her work, though, even though she was a very famous poet, she wasn't actually out in her work, and I realized that she actually didn't feel like she was free enough to do that. And so this is a poem for her, and it's called A Desperate Stonewall Love Poem, and I'll just get into that. And yeah, and so thank y'all for all that y'all do, and thank y'all for being the rock stars that you are, for creating that again, that we are co-creating liberation together, not just from adults into youth, right? But that we are co-collaborating on this always, right? That you all are creating some liberation that many of us across all age groups and even your ancestors might not have got to feel, right? 50 years after the fact, I am standing in the store rifling through the crisp pages of a famous old lesbian's poetry book, created just months ago by beautiful butch hands that have become bitter from penning notes to her male lover, fictitiously invented for her conservative fan base and her elderly mother's weak heart. And it strikes me, amongst all these words devoid of her own emotional presence, that I expected her to write me a poem. I wanted her to write me a poem. I wanted her to write me the sweetest of love poems about my kinky hair, about my brown skin, about our smooth hips, about what two queer bodies must look like moving through the dark. I wanted her to write me a love poem about freedom. I wanted her to write me a love poem that would convince a father his 13-year-old trans son was still a child and not a leather-bound punching bag. I wanted her to write me a love poem that would house 1,000 trans kids that have not had a home to go to. I wanted her to write me a love poem that would petition activists in DC and tell them that drinking champagne, eating hors d'oeuvres is never more important than ending the violent deportation of Black and brown bodies. I wanted her to write me a love poem that lets two boxer-wearing trans boys hold hands down a dark alley and not feel fear of their neighbors or the police. I wanted her to write me a love poem that would have saved the lives of Tyra Hunter, Naja Morris, Erica Keels, and Sakia Gunn. I wanted her to write me a love poem that lets a lesbian English teacher in Tennessee simultaneously keep her job and a picture of her first lover on her desk. I wanted her to write me a love poem that would have tucked me in at 16 and told me it was okay to want love, to try love, to feel loved, and that the true sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was about greed. I wanted her to write me a poem because to her other fans, it could have been just that, but to us, it would have been so much more. Okay. All right. So thank y'all for letting me share my poems with you. You know, I think especially when we talk about art, that I was talking to some folks earlier just about what representation means, right? That it's not just, I think, important for us to see ourselves represented in art, but also for us to be able to see each other and witness each other in life, again, as Black, brown, Indigenous folks, as trans folks, as queer folks, as folks across disability, as folks across citizenship, across like all these different things, to see us, especially for those of us coming from targeted communities, having lives that we love, that we're passionate about, that we're excited about, and being connected to our other communities, right? So yeah, so I just want to kind of end it there because I do want to leave space for questions. But yeah, do y'all have any questions for me as anything I shared, as just a real life Black trans Muslim adult, as an artist and activist in the world? Any question, you can feel free to pop in the chat or come off your mute. You have so many questions. Well, listen, let me tell you something, Ruby. I love questions and answers. So you let me know, and I got the question and the answer. Okay.
I kind of have a question too, if that's all right.
Yeah.
How do you feel like growing up in a deeply religious space helped identify more with your queerness? Because for me, I grew up, Catholic, and I think that was a different experience for me, but I'm curious to, hear a little bit about like how, like, is whether religion is still a part of your life, or if it's something that, you appreciate having like grown up around.
Yeah, so both and I think to your question, like that. So for those, so in my in my bio, one of the things that was mentioned is I'm the co-director and co-editor of a project called the Black Trans Prayer Book, in which myself and my colleague Lady Dane Figueroa Didi have collected the stories and faith stories and spirituality notes and experiences of Black trans folks from all over the US and beyond, right? And so I would say that faith is a really big part of my life right now. I would say I'm less committed to specific religious traditions. Like I don't particularly, so I feel connected to both Islam and Christianity, having been raised by a Muslim father and a Christian mother. I'm not necessarily particularly invested in the structure of religion, if that makes sense to people. To me, when I think about, so even the story I shared before about Yusuf and Joseph, that to me is a very powerful story about my coming out, because if people are not familiar with that story, Yusuf/Joseph is one of the few people in text that gets like that. One, there's this theologian named Peterson Thomas Toscano, as well as others, but this is the one that I'm most familiar with, talks about Joseph being a potentially trans character, and particularly because of the garment that Joseph gets from their father Jacob. And so the garment is the Ketuneth Pasim. It exists in only one other place in the Bible, which is with Princess Tamar. And so if you look at the Bible notes, for people that are really into the Bible notes, I read the Bible notes, typically in most Bibles, it says the meaning of this garment, when it's talking about Joseph, the meaning of this garment is unclear, or what this garment is unclear. When it gets to Tamar, they're clear that this is the garment of a princess, right? So they're very clear on what it means in 2 Samuel, but not clear when it comes to Joseph. And so what happens once Joseph gets this garment that could also be described as a princess dress, Joseph is attacked, goes through all these trials and tribulations, ends up being incarcerated at some point, goes through domestic violence, sexual violence, all these different things, which to me, unfortunately, are very trans experiences. But fortunately for me, as someone reading both Quran and Bible, Yusuf gets accountability in a way that many other characters in scripture do not. And also is someone who foresees their future in a way that the people around them do not and cannot, which is another trans experience, that we speak ourselves into existence, right? We speak our futures and our possibility into existence. So I would say to me that I definitely get a lot of uplift from text and scripture, both within traditional text as well as what I believe is scripture outside of those things and outside of religious doctrine. And at least on the Muslim side of my family, we were taught that your relationship to God or Allah is individual, and no one else can speak to your relationship. And so I saw that having such a big impact on how I was able to come out. Like on the Christian side of my family, I come from a lot of clergy folks and a lot of pastors, bishops, and stuff like that, where people, learned faith from a very passive way, in the sense of what whoever is at the pulpit says, that's what it is, good, bad, or indifferent. And so from that side of the family, coming out was actually very hard, because they learned it from a very trans and queer negative space, versus the Muslim side of my family. We specifically learned from this framework that even though my Muslim family didn't completely understand, I don't want to say that they all completely understood me coming out as a trans person, they were much more readily accepting of my pronouns and my stuff, because their faith practice taught them from a much more expansive place. And so, yeah, so I would say that the way that we look at faith has real world implications. So even for my folks that don't identify with faith, accepting that a lot of us have religious trauma, that we have a right to get rid of. I hope that answered your question. That was a very big, long rant. I really do.
Yeah, that totally did. That was beautiful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that question. Yeah. Any other questions that people might have?
I have many questions. I'm trying to figure out
many questions.
Where to start.
Yeah.
I think this is kind of a two-part question.
Okay.
The first part is I feel, as sort of a freshly out of the closet person, I have been feeling this feeling of being not trans enough,
Mhm.
and I've been feeling very hesitant to use that label as somebody who's not as like physically visible as trans. Um, and I know that there is space for me within that label, but I'm wondering how you go about, if you've struggled with that, and how you go about addressing it. And then also, how do you go about if you've experienced like being misgendered? Because
Mhm.
I am trying to gain the confidence to be able to correct people, and I would love to hear some advice.
Yeah. So two things with that. So in particular, what I want to be kind of clear about for myself is um, number one, that not just that transness looks and is experienced in so many different ways on a more macro scale, but even individually during your lifetime, the ways that you embody your transness can look and feel different, right? So I'll say for when I was first coming out, I started the coming out process for myself, for my transness about 18 years ago. I was like, I think 19 at the time when I started coming out in that way. And I'd already been out as a queer person, but that was when I was coming into my transness more specifically. With that, there were certain things that I didn't necessarily feel like I needed or wanted around the ways that I felt. I didn't necessarily particularly experience dysphoria. I still wouldn't say that I just experienced dysphoria around body stuff, even though I know a lot of my colleagues and loved ones do. As I got older, there were certain things that I wanted, like I didn't, like hormones were not a part of my journey. I started taking hormones, when I was like in my 30s, right? So I'd already been out as trans for a long time. I, my pronouns definitely have shifted from the time I was like 19 to now. So, and I say that to say that who you are as trans could, be exactly how you feel and look and experience the world right now today for the rest of your lifetime. There is also this space in which, like, for all of our transness, because our relationships to our bodies change over time, which is real regardless of if you're trans or not. It just does, the ways in which, because, of all the different reasons, right? Yeah, so I mean, so one that's, I would say, to be okay taking up space in that way, I think, and also knowing for yourself the gradations of privilege that we have in those things. When I was, I would say, even experiencing life, so even as a trans mass person, one thing that I like to also experience to tell other people, especially who, whether you're trans mass, whether people are, or in some ways are people who do not experience what it means to be, especially a Black or brown or indigenous trans woman in trans space, like there's a privilege that we have. And so understanding even just dynamics of what does it mean to not have privilege in cis spaces, but have privilege within trans community about things like that. So I do tell people that we need to be considerate of and think about how we show up in spaces around that. Aside from that, yeah, like no one has a right to tell you what your trans experience gets to be or look like. So feel confident in that. Like, I've been there. It's cool. You still trans, right? Like, so you trans because you say you're trans. That's it. Like a lot of our ancestors didn't have access to like hormones or surgery or anything like that, right? And not even, and I think that many of them, even if they were offered them, still wouldn't want them, right? So like that transness is beyond other people's designation of what our gender presentation should be, right? It's about how we feel in ourselves and understanding transness as a rite of passage to me in many ways. Like I think, so to me, even going back to the last question, I see transness, especially for me as a Black person, as a sacred rite of passage. Like it's definitely connected to my Blackness more. It's definitely connected to my, to my spirituality more, all those things. In terms of talking to people about pronouns, when I was first coming out to transness, you said that you were, kind of just starting out in your transness, right? In terms, not starting out in your transness, but starting out in your coming out process, right? I was way more polite when I was coming out about my pronouns than I am today, right? I'll say that. When I was first coming out, I was like, oh, I know it's an adjustment. Ugh, you're gonna get this, it's okay, it's whatever, oh, like, or people would ask me, what do you want to be called? Do you want to be called this name or this name? I'd be like, oh, well, it's okay. If you know me from this other time in school. Now I'm like, don't you dare ever call me nothing except for what I told you to call. That's it. So also giving space for yourself that you're gonna get tired at some point of being misgendered, right? That you already might be tired, but you're gonna get real extra tired in your bones, because it's not just about how you're treated, it's also about when a trans person is misgendered, that's the reverberation that's heard around the world, right? Because not just that you're being misgendered, but it's also sometimes can teach people how to or not to respect other trans people that come after us, right? And so you might not be at a place right now where you feel emboldened yet to kind of take up that space. So I do want you to forgive yourself for that right now, but there's going to be a time when it's not, you're going to get out of this space of self of like, this is my coming out experience, but again, just space of this is our collective experience as trans people that's going to help you, kind of beef it up a bit and be like, no, like you have to call me this, not just for me, but because there's going to be other little trans folks and elder trans folks, right? That again, that didn't get that space to get talked to and spoken to with respect, that are that will also benefit from us being spoken to correctly. So I'm hoping that answers your piece.
Yes, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you. Y'all got me feeling very loquacious. Y'all got very, y'all got questions that got me feeling very talkative today, very chatty. Okay, inshallah. Any other questions that come up for folks? And also just because I see you saying, Ruby, like, oh, I'm a little tired of being polite. Yeah, like that's, and you don't have to be polite, right? So like there's, I'll be honest, that even around, depending on what our relationships are to people, right? So I'm saying this now being in my mid 30s and being able to like kind of have a different type of relationship, having a little bit more control over some of my relationships. There was a time when I was in my 20s when I had to have relationships with my parents and my family and be like, hey, if you actually don't call me this or do this thing, like we don't actually have to be around each other all the time. Like there was a shifting point for me that I was like I don't actually have to keep putting myself in situations where I'm being misgendered, disdained, all that. Like if I care for you well, talking to me correctly is also you caring for me, right? And so let's even just talk about it as an equitable relationship. This is equitable, and I get your name and your pronouns right together every day. You got to at least return that in kind, because that's what I think people often miss, is like getting a trans person's pronouns right is not the end of a conversation. It's proof that you can even have a conversation about trans people's rights. Yeah, you should not, like, because it's very impolite. It's very I'm like, are we cursing today? We're cursing. It's messed up. I don't know if we're cursing, because I know this is going to be used later for some high school spaces, might get rated R. Okay, so all that. Okay. Any other questions that come up for people? And again, it could be about activism. It could be about any stuff I shared with y'all. It could be myself and Tandem. I'm looking around to see, making eye contact with all the folks that are still on camera, making eye contact with everyone. Even if you're not making eye contact with me, I'm making eye contact with you. Okay. And stuff.
Like, do we want to bring up all the legislative bills in the states that are happening? Like,
do you? You tell me what, because I said like intentionality to me is about what do we have capacity for emotionally and spiritually,
yes.
right? So what you got capacity
for? That might also be like the capacity for trans folks too, of seeing all the legislations in all the different states happening, and we're already tired, and so the cis folks might be coming to us about that, of asking us, oh, how do you feel? Or is there always like that check-in with other trans folks? Like, should we be checking in with each other for all these bills, or reaching out to the other states of like how are you doing? Or there's always that kind of hesitancy to check in on our other trans folks because the emotional balance, because we're being attacked so much. Like, that's not really like a question, but it's that like the depth and the balance of where do we and when do we reach out to each other in those situations, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's whenever you feel like you have that energy, right? Because the reality is trans people as a whole are tired. You know, it's a lot to have. And this is also the thing, so real pet peeve I have is when I see these bills coming up and in the media, it'll say anti-LGBTQ legislation. It's like, it's not anti-LGBTQ legislation, it's anti-trans legislation. And that's specific. And I think that's really specific because we need to acknowledge the ways that many times, especially like cisgender spaces, and even like when I think about the history and legacy of LGBTQ rights in this country, that a lot of the rights that LGBTQ folks have on paper was argued from a standpoint of anti-trans stuff, like anti-trans rhetoric, right? That we're gay or we're bisexual or we're lesbians, but we're not like those people. Like when I think about the history of organizations like the Medellin Society or Daughters of Bilitis, even the Human Rights Campaign, right? That a lot of those organizations raise lots and lots and lots of dollars to pass legislation and to get different things passed, not even just legislation, but even just when I think about mental health and wellness things and medicalization stuff that benefited solely cisgender LGBT people, right? And so, so that kind of tiredness when we talk about those different levels and layers of privilege, even within community, trans people should not be the only ones reaching out to make sure people are okay. That I think that it's a special type of anxiety, depression, and things that can come up in other sort of mental health illnesses and syndromes that can be triggered or exacerbated by not just having to deal with antagonism in your school or in your neighborhood, or sometimes, right, we're also in our family sometimes, but also on the political landscape all the time of people that are not trans arguing about whether or not we're people or whether or not we should exist, right? Like just, you know, so I think that cis people as well as trans people should be reaching out, but especially trans people only when we have capacity, because I do think that in order to, for the revolution to be realized, we got to survive long enough for the revolution, okay? So trans people deserve rest, and especially Black, and also recognizing that these bills, even though these bills do not say just trans people or just Black and brown indigenous trans folks, understanding that these bills will largely impact Black trans women and trans femmes, brown and indigenous trans women, trans femmes, more than anybody else on trans spectrum, and Black, brown, indigenous folks as a whole after that, you know, and all these things, and especially disabled trans folks. So even just understanding the gradations, right, of how we show up for folks. I'm hoping, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Do you have any general suggestions as well as specifically for teachers to support the trans community and our trans students? Yeah, oh my goodness, there's so many different things. So number one, I think that, again, that trans people and trans students deserve to see trans folks, right? So I know that there was some different issues that came up specifically around you know, elementary school students being able to read something as simple as I am Jazz, right? Which is such a very simple story and very lovely story, right? And doesn't even get into all the complicatedness of a trans existence, I think at a antagonism type of level, right? I think that, yeah, so it's that trans people need to be normalized. We need to, it needs, like, there's this place in which, going back to this lack of empathy that we talked about empathy earlier in this session, I see people who have such capacity to do good things bow at the whim of people that do not care if trans people survive, that do not care if Black and brown people survive, do not care if indigenous people survive, all those different things, right? And so there's gotta be a way in which, honestly, that one, there needs to be more trans educators. There's a lot of states in which trans people are not allowed to be educators or not allowed to be worked with, or are somehow criminalized for working with young people. As a trans person who has worked with young people, there is and continues to work with young people, there's a way that trans folks are scrutinized in ways that our cisgender counterparts are not. And I know many of our cisgender queer folks also experience this, but because trans people tend to be more visible because of whether it's presentation, whether it's because of pronouns, whether it's all those different things, there's ways that we are expeditiously, scrutinized. So I think educators can advocate more for actual trans staff members. Like, young people also witness the way that you treat trans adults, right? And so I see a lot of spaces that will advocate for trans youth without advocating for trans adults. And I guarantee you that those trans youth are not going to be served well by spaces that only teach them that cis people are the only good people that can actually support them, right? So I think it's advocating for trans staff, for trans faculty, all those things. I think it's about inviting the normalizing spaces in which we, even on forums, being able to not just ask young people what their pronouns are, but actually sticking with it. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've looked at rosters in which a young person has a student has actually said, these are my pronouns, this is my name, only for their teacher or their substitute for the day to misname them, right? Or to have them be outed by, by their school to their parents, right? So I think we need to be fighting against those sort of things. Which goes beyond even just like, I see so much, we spend so much time on bathroom bills and things like that, which are extremely important so that we have access to safe facilities. And also just the human thing, we need to have more trans people in our schools at all levels. Yeah, I know that's like a ramble of a few different things. There's so much. So also just hit me up too later after this, because there's so much to say about supporting trans community and trans students in our schools, right? So I see here, white LGBTQ people need to recognize their privilege and do everything they can to support trans people of color. There are rights to primarily trans women of color. Yeah, so just acknowledging. So when we talk about intersectionality, I don't know how much people went into all of the pieces around intersectionality. One limitation I see often people make around using the term intersectionality is like, oh, intersectionality is about all of our identities like meeting up like intersections on a road, which is true, right? They're partially true, right? So when Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term that many of us use now to talk about all the different ways our identities show up, she's a lawyer that specifically deals with with discrimination, right? So she was looking at it from a standpoint and a vantage point of looking at the ways that different people at those various intersections are not just criminalized, but also experience discrimination. And so a lot of our rights, right, are fought by the people that are most impacted by violence, are most impacted by lack of access to work, lack of access to housing, lack of access to resources, which are people that we usually don't advocate for in our spaces because we don't see them because they've been silenced that much, right? That when I go, especially in higher ed, I'm way more likely to see trans mass folks than I am to see trans femme folks. And especially when we break it down by race, like definitely way more likely to see white trans folks in spaces than I do Black, Brown, Indigenous folks, right? And so we have to also prepare our spaces for the ways we want them to be, not just making it safe for just people who are there right now, but future, 15 years from now. Who do you want to be there? Who do you want to call this place home? Who do you want to actually advocate for if you're invested in the space surviving? Okay, does that make sense for folks? Good stuff, good stuff. Okay. I think I might be a little over time. I'm not sure because I know we were a little bit behind time. Do we have time? Is there any one last question? If anyone has one last question. I know I just said I was over time and then I proceeded to ask if there was another question, but Black trans folks, we got to take up space. So we're just going to take up space today. So that's also, that's also the game. I want to also, model what that looks like, right? So any one last question that anybody has? I'm gonna do the Jeopardy song. Do 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 do. Do y'all know Jeopardy still? Do y'all watch Jeopardy? Is that generational now? Am I like dating myself?
I know the tune.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Inshallah. Okay. You watch just so you can be Gabriel on it. Okay. All right. Alex Trebek. Yeah, Alex Trebek. I'm hoping that what's the name? Oh my goodness, now his name is escaping me. Jory LaForge. What's his actual name? LeVar Burton. I want LeVar Burton to be the permanent Jeopardy guy right now. Yeah. But yeah, so if no one has any other additional questions, I'm just going to share my contact information for folks on the screen real quick here. Yeah, so please feel free to reach out. This is all my stuff. You can take a picture, wherever else have you. And I look forward to connecting with y'all again in the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mase. That was an amazing speech, poems, everything. We loved it. And I feel like we all learned a lot, right? You did a great time. I'm just so taken aback. I'm sorry.
I'm like, I try to be a good time, I try to be a good time,
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No, but you did a great job. And yeah, it was, just so much. Thank you for everything, for being here, for spending time with us, for educating us, and for making everybody feel safe here.
Thank you all. And again, shout out to all y'all as organizers. I truly appreciate what y'all have created today. And just thank you for having me. Just 100% having me.
We hope to see you again, maybe. So right now we're going into a 10-minute break, I believe. Are we going to shorten it to 5 minutes because we're running low on time? I don't. Well, we're going to take a break. So take a breather, get a snack, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do. I'm going to say we'll meet back here at 4:50, but we can give you a bit more time if you need. So yeah, just take a load off. We learned a lot and it's been an amazing time, and we'll see you then.